First up, as promised when we talked last week, it's the evolving story of just what the hell the Trump administration's policy really is. In fact, you could say that on just about anything. But here we are with the Wall Street Journal opinion page praising Trump. Now, if you're at all familiar with the Wall Street Journal, it's a curious hybrid of pretty decent reporting on like economic affairs and some even some foreign affairs stuff in terms of its actual reporting. Its opinion pages, though, come a broadcast straight from Dick Cheney's crypt. And this is a fine example of that. And they're referring, of course, to Trump stating in a press conference and then rambling about it repeatedly that he was sick of Putin basically being very polite but saying no to him. This caused this rather tickled the fancy of the Wall Street Journal opinion page, who are now very happy with the fact that Trump is now sounding more like Biden, basically. Because what Trump said, in essence, was that he was ringing Putin, and Putin basically has kept reiterating the official position of the Russian government. And Trump is now getting apparently tired of this. But in my view, what is being unveiled here is that Trump's actual position, when it came down to it, is in essence the position outlined by General Kellogg, who was assigned to be the point man on this, even though the Russians don't want to speak to him, which was that the plan that Kellogg put his name to, published, I believe, before Trump came into office, which was that essentially Russia would keep basically what it's got at the moment, in terms of Ukraine, former Ukrainian territory. The Kiev regime would be left in place, and there would be a commitment to not join NATO for a decade or so. So it's essentially a slightly more advanced version of what was already on the table in early 2022 from the Biden administration, who kept saying, oh, Ukraine's not joining NATO. But as we'll see, when we talk about this, and when we talk about the Azerbaijan relationship with NATO, there's more than one way to be part of NATO. There's also different tiers of NATO membership and involvement. And if the Russians accepted the deal that Trump, through Steve Witkoff, in the end, was putting to them, they would essentially agree that the Kiev regime should remain in place. And if the Kiev regime remains in place, even if there's no NATO, not formally anyway, what will happen is the same process that occurred prior to early 2022, which is that the British in particular, but also the French now and the Germans, will work to recover the situation for the Ukrainian military and basically use the gap in the fighting to rearm and retool and retrain their Ukrainian outsourced army, then launch it again at the Russians in a few years' time, which would not only be unacceptable to the Russian government, but it would also create severe internal political problems for Putin and others at the top of the Russian government. So the fact that the Russians didn't go for this should be no surprise to anybody. It is apparently a surprise to Trump. And now, like the Wall Street Journal and the other, what I would call like extreme militarists inside the U.S. Imperium, are thinking that they're going to get their way again. But Kit, I'll throw it to you now for your analysis of where things stand with regard to this and the apparent contradictory and sort of swirling bullshitting of the Trump administration.
Well, I mean, I might at this point take our viewers back to in the lead up to the 2024 US presidential election. Putin said that it didn't matter who won the election, and there was all sorts of speculation about how this was some 5D chess move in which he was trying to manipulate people into thinking that he didn't want Trump to win when he did. No. I think that what he was saying was literally true, is that it wasn't going to change anything, Trump getting in. despite his assorted pledges to end this within 48 hours of taking office, or within 90 days of taking office, or all of these ever changing, rock solid undertakings. And yes, the effectively, as is so often so has been the case over and over again, the when on the rare occasions that US and European officials actually talk to the Russians, they reiterate their position, which has remained unchanged since February 2022, if not before, which is neutral Ukraine, no foreign missile systems on its soil, a limit on how big its armed forces can be, and yes, a moratorium on NATO membership. Now, setting out a fairly basic, set of requirements, which this is a generous versus what the US would demand of Canada or NATO, Canada or Mexico, if a Russian-led NATO alternative existed and they were on the verge of joining it. It's unsurprising that we remain at this impasse, and I think that we've also seen recently that there, as we reported on and kind of broke the story which passed the media by, there was a moratorium on any further military aid to Ukraine. This was then further revised to even the existing commitments from the Biden administration wouldn't be sent. We'll get into this more later, but this seems to have been undone. The significance of that is questionable, to say the least. Although, for the time being, the narrative is Trump has had enough of Putin's intransigence, and the US is back in the game in terms of supporting Ukraine. I don't actually think that this is true, for reasons that we can get into.
Well, the way in which this is being presented now is that Trump is changing his mind, and is going to be basically back in to the same mode that the Biden administration was in, including, of course, we'll just share this from the New York Times, there's going to be a vote on even more sanctions against Russian oil and gas and other things as well, which the Lindsey Graham-led faction in the U.S. Senate, which is almost all of the U.S. Senate, are trumpeting this. But there is a problem with both of these angles, as Kit suggests, which is that the problem that they have with the weapons supplies is that they just don't have what Ukraine needs, and aren't likely to have it in the short term or even the medium term either, because they've already had to switch priorities. And part of it was the fact that Israel was essentially getting a beating from Iran, and now the US needs to switch to putting more air defense, such as that exists inside Israel, resupplying Israel with both missiles and ammunition, readying for the next round with Iran, which everybody knows is coming. Apart from, it would appear, the president of Iran, but that's another story. So Ukraine, even if Trump says, "Oh, we're back in the game," isn't going to get what it needs. If you look at the reports coming even from pro-NATO sources such as Julian Rupke and others who've always been sort of fanatically pro-NATO, admitting that the Russian airstrikes and missile strikes on Ukraine now dwarf anything that's happened before, and that the advances of the Russian armed forces are huge in comparative terms and gaining in momentum every day. So the fact is that we're going back to the sanctions question, why would this work when the previous, 19 rounds haven't worked at all? So a lot of this is posturing, and a lot of this is just melodramatics. Trump probably thinks, if Trump does think, that if he sort of bangs the table and screams a lot, that the Russians will back down. He still either doesn't understand or could never understand that the Russians not only won't back down, but can't, in essence, because this is the reason why the whole special military operation started in the first place. So this is, a lot of it is just noise. And I think it comes back to the fact that the policy, I think Trump, if he had his own way, wanted to just impose this Kellogg deal on the Russians and basically say that the war wasn't his problem anymore, get Ukraine to say no to NATO formally for 10 years, then he can say the war is over and focus elsewhere. None of this is happening. So instead, because they can't actually help the Kiev regime much with anything anymore, what they'll do is pretend to and make a lot of noise about it and try and go along with the British policy of just spinning out the war at all costs. So that is in effect what is going on. It won't change anything, but it changes the mood music, which is, I think, Kit, all that some people in Washington were actually looking for, which is a change in like the tone and the messaging rather than the content.
Yeah, precisely. And it's like, I mean, I think back to that what increasingly looks like a staged incident. Was it in February or March when JD Vance and Trump had a major bust up with Zelensky? Now, if you think about like the response to the kind of Russiagate blue anon response to that was, well, we now have proof that Trump is a Russian asset and that the tapes of him being peed on in Moscow do exist, etc. Like now that the rhetoric of negativity towards Russia and hostility and agitation is back, well, people are a bit like, okay, thank God. Okay, that's fine. And it's like, yeah, and that's all it amounts to, because it's, again, we're kind of like skipping around the show notes slightly here, but I think what's important to note is that a large number of people who were cheering the fact that US military aid was seemingly over for Ukraine and wondering how long Ukraine could hold on. I was certainly in the latter category. I thought that this could well be, the kind of final stages of this. I and a great many people were caught off guard by Trump announcing that he was going to resume weapon shipments, and the pause was blamed on poor Pete Hegseth, who seems to be the kind of whipping boy and fool guy for whenever Trump has to do a reverse ferret. But if you actually look at the detail of what Trump is offering, is claiming that he is going to send to the Ukrainians, emphasis on claiming. Okay, number one, it's defensive weapons. So this is not assisting Ukraine to carry out strikes in Russia against Russia, which is a very crucial caveat. And it does tend to suggest that the US, as far as it has a strategy in Ukraine, is just kind of push this out as long as possible, with the inevitable outcome being that like Russia emerges victorious. The only question is by how much and how long that takes. But even then, when you break down what these defensive weapons amount to, this includes stuff like the Patriot missiles, which, number one, have been consistently shown to be completely useless, and Russia has like pretty consistently just destroyed outright, and an enormous amount of missile, very difficult and costly to replace missiles have been used in the process. The Guardian has published an exclusive report that the US has only a quarter of all Patriot missile interceptors needed for Pentagon military plans, and according to the Guardian, the Pentagon has what's known as a global munitions tracker internally, which is meant to tabulate how many weapons the US has and ensure that limits on its stockpiles aren't breached and dipped into. And it seems that this has been the case since the Biden administration, that well-established restrictions on what can be used and sent to allies have basically been torn up and ignored. So they don't even have the defensive weapons they claim they're going to send to Ukraine, which would probably not be particularly effective anyway. And like, I mean, as I have seen numerous, and I even include it in the show notes, I've seen numerous maps of recent Russian military missile and drone strikes on Ukraine. They're quite extraordinary. Like, they are striking everywhere across the country. They are wiping out all manner of infrastructure, and there's the Russians also seem to be targeting conscription sites or centers where people who are dragged off the streets of major Ukrainian cities and ferried to against their will so that they can die on the front line horribly within about an hour of arrival. These recruitment centers appear to be getting targeted specifically. Now, this doesn't only wipe out potential new recruits. I've seen some people, maybe tongue-in-cheek, maybe not, suggest this is a way of Russia winning hearts and minds in Ukraine. By wiping out all of the much hated conscription gangs roaming the streets.
Well, I think that there might be something to that, given that there is like a considerable internal revolt inside Ukraine, according to analysts such as former Swiss military intelligence officer Colonel Jacques Beau, who seems to be tracking this. Like, there are several internal rebel factions inside Ukraine now, not all of which, by the way, are pro-Russian. There are rebel groups inside the west of Ukraine, in like the heart of Bandera land, where they are actively resisting the press gang operations that have been roving around, abducting any man who stands still longer than about a second. And there's considerable domestic opposition to these press gangs, just as really the actual support for the continuation of the war is very low, even in Ukraine, because actually, so that Zelensky, Olyak, and others can beat a retreat eventually to their villas in Miami, and nobody wants to die for that. But also, the fact is that the TCC itself, the press gang operation, I had should we say, a source from Moscow emailed me a while back with some details on where the TCC came from. And what this source, whose information on Ukrainian matters has been good before, said was that the TCC was actually founded as a private company in 2007. So this is latter period of Yushchenko. So they were setting up like press gang operations run by essentially a private company operating under contract to the Kiev government for almost 20 years ago now. And had been because the plan was already there that this would happen eventually. They wanted it under Yushchenko, but he was, didn't have the necessary force in place to do it. But they continued to develop the TCC all the way through the intervening Yanukovych years until they were ready to launch it in a major way. So this press gang operation, which is so loathed by Ukrainians, was a hell of a long time in the making. And apparently the British were heavily involved with its foundation, which again shouldn't be a surprise. But the fact that the Russians are going after this in the way they are now, which has led even the American press in the form of the Washington Post to admit that this is happening, and also that this is clearly which most Ukrainians are going to welcome, these bastards getting blown the hell. It's clear that the Russians do have an eye for the next phase, which is that whatever Ukrainians' opinions on the Russian government, the fact is that the Kiev regime has got to the point now where it is so despised and so hated by an awful lot of Ukrainians that actually whatever the Russians do in the next phase is probably, if it brings peace and relative stability, the actual space for the kind of insurgency that the British in particular want to wage, the political space for that, is going to be limited because the Kiev regime, the longer it continues, the more disgraced and despised it's going to get. And the more difficult it will be to hold it up as a government in exile, which more Ukrainians should die for. So I think this is probably a smart move on behalf of the Russians. And it also speaks to the fact that, again, the longer this goes on, in actual fact, the less likely it is that many Ukrainians are going to want to sign on for the guerrilla war that the NATO countries or some of the NATO countries have in mind. What do you reckon to that?
Well, absolutely. And I think that, I mean, before the war even started, there were people like Hillary Clinton who were talking about recreating an Afghan 1970 and 80s style insurgency in Ukraine that would just make occupation a nightmare for the Russians. We have, of course, I myself at the Grey Zone have exposed British plans to craft secret partisan armies and Gladio style units across Ukraine who on paper are normal people living normal lives, but would carry out sabotage and assassinations and bombings and all sorts of things. I mean, yeah, as you mentioned, like the enthusiasm just isn't there. Now, I mean, if you actually look at if you look at polls, which is this is something that is amazingly absent from any mainstream discussion of continuing the war, where as we've discussed, you have all of these people like George Monbiot saying, well, the Ukrainians want to keep fighting, so we should just keep going. It is a lie. They don't want. They don't. Yes, even in the Banderite heartlands of Western Ukraine, they don't want this to carry on. There is growing levels of I would say like outright hatred of the Zelensky government because of a variety, and again we'll get into this in due course, a variety of things that he has done using the powers vested in him under martial law. Again, we the presidential election, which didn't happen last year, we were meant to have elections in Ukraine this year. Then they're not going to happen either. It seems it is likely, if they did, that Zelensky's Servants of the People Party would be completely wiped out. Therefore, leaving him pretty much left out in the cold, despite his sweeping powers under martial law, and also as well, it's I think that the general population is just so tired of this that even the BBC published a report a few months back, which it didn't get nearly enough traction, but it was talking about how the BBC spoke to a large number of residents of the Ukraine, and overwhelmingly, people said that they thought that Ukraine should have gone for peace in April 2022. When we know that Boris Johnson personally sabotaged it. And amazingly, of course, we know that the key to sabotaging the peace negotiations from Britain's perspective was portraying Bucha, which is a very mysterious incident, as a deliberate genocide of innocent Ukrainian civilians. And that same BBC report acknowledged that the peace negotiations were hampered by quote unquote alleged Russian war crimes. Now, this is the same British state broadcaster that put out a program on called Ukraine: The Information War, featuring our dear friend Paul Mason, in which it was stated by numerous talking heads, including Mariana Spring, the head of BBC's Verify division and a very spooky individual, saying anyone questioning Bucha is Russian culpability for Bucha is assisting, whether wittingly or not, Russian disinformation strategies. And now the BBC acknowledges that the Russian culpability for the event is only alleged, and serious questions hang over what happened and why and who was actually responsible. So, yeah, I think that basically we've reached this point where you have a population who is not willing to fight any longer, that wants this over. The determination to keep this going is not shared by the Ukrainian population, but also I would say Ukraine's political class. The only reason that they are clinging on is because they know that they are likely to be hung, drawn, and quartered if they don't escape first.